Hello, this is Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Miles Smith. He's an assistant professor of history at Hillsdale College in Michigan. And he took on a very interesting project recently, which is he decided to read all of the Exvangelical Memoirs he could put his hands on and all of the books about Christian nationalism that he could put his hands on. And he's been tweeting a lot of really interesting observations as he reads those books. And so I'm sure there will be more articles to come. But he put together a very interesting article for Mere Orthodoxy. I believe it's called Reading the Exvangelicals, that talked about what he has taken away from reading those memoirs. There's a link in the show notes. So check that out. And he joined me today to talk about his Exvangelical reading project. So Miles, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for having me.
I might have to get you back on here to talk about Christian nationalism, which may be an even more incendiary topic.
Absolutely. Two robust topics.
For those who may not have a firm grasp in their mind, what is an exvangelical?
The best sort of definition I've come up with is someone who at some point was either publicly or institutionally involved in what's been broadly called evangelicalism, sort of, pietistic adjacent, revival adjacent expression of low church Protestantism, and they've publicly left the movement. They've not necessarily said they're not a Christian, but they've publicly sort of repudiated the evangelical movement.
So you have to sort of identify as an exvangelical to become an exvangelical. You can't just leave and be quiet about it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you're an exvangelical, you've not been ambiguous about it.
Yeah, well, there's the old quip: if a tree fell in the forest and no one was there to hear it, would it really make a sound? And I'm somewhat wondering, if an exvangelical deconstructs their faith and doesn't write a memoir about it, did it really happen?
That's a great question. One of the things I think is there's a market right now for this in the way there hasn't been. This happened in the 80s and 90s. There were people who sort of left evangelical churches. Some prominent conservative Protestants left evangelical churches. I think of prominent Roman Catholic converts from evangelicalism, but we don't really see the same interest in their stories in the same way. And I think that's because so much of evangelicalism in the 80s and 90s was attached to politics. And so we've had this moment where Trump has become a public figure. And so anybody who sort of wants to refract politics off religion, they're a lot more interesting if they're angry about it now. So,
yeah. And in a sense, my impression is that in the 80s, if you left evangelicalism to become a Catholic, it's because you were becoming more religiously conservative in a sense, whereas the exvangelicals are sort of leaving conservative religion behind, if you will, or reacting against it in a different sort of way.
Yeah, there seems to be, it's the Exvangelical Memoirs as Exvangelical Memoirs are almost always people moving right to left. In the sort of a broad political spectrum. I think there are what I call right-wing exvangelicals. They just don't identify as exvangelicals because they still are very much coded politically as Christian and conservative in a way that at least what you might call the telemedia consumer class isn't interested in that story. They're interested in the people moving right to left.
Yeah. Are these books selling a lot of copies? Is this a legitimate phenomenon, or is this just something that the editors like to put them out?
Some of them are selling well. One of the better sellers is Sarah McCammon's book, The Exvangelicals. And I think it sold well because it is very well written. And she's a sparkling good writer, and she tells a good story, tells it very effectively. John Ward's testimony has also been very successful, and it's also very well written. Both of those are figures who had journalistic training, I should note. So it's not just anybody can be an exvangelical. You have to have access to certain aptitudes and perhaps certain institutions as well.
Do you think that the public exvangelicals that people see are representative of a certain type of person more broadly who is leaving evangelicalism?
I think so. A lot of the exvangelicals actually come from a pretty specific brand of evangelicalism, a sort of charismatic adjacent, moral majority adjacent, very politically active brand of evangelicalism. I grew up in a denomination that was part of the National Association of Evangelicals until recently. I grew up in the PCA, and we didn't do that much politics at church. But these are churches that these evangelicals are coming out of that are deeply political. Involved with Marches for Life, and also with basic charity causes too. I don't want to just say they're involved with abortion politics, but that seems to have been the energy of church. Even the energy of church for so many of these people was political, and not what you might call sacramental or spiritual.
Yeah, you get at one of the things that you found, the sort of common threads, is these churches tended to be charismatic. Or charismatic adjacent, you might say, in style. Again, moral majority, religious right, politically active. What are some other themes that you found in this?
Very little in the way of ecclesiastical structure in these churches that these folks came out of. You would typically have a sort of pastor figure, depending on what tradition. And most of them are called pastor, but you would have a pastor as a sort of catch-all guru to answer all of life's questions. So if you had a question about something hard in the moral, civil, political realms, religious realm as well, you went to the pastor. And so I think whatever good intention was behind that, it led to a socio-political culture whereby sort of pastors at given churches became almost figures with papal power. They could kind of pronounce sort of de facto anathemas on things or encourage certain things, and to give it sort of the thus saith the Lord imprimatur. And so I think that what you realize is these are, I would propose they're almost post-Protestant in their ecclesiology. They're not recognizably governed in the way that historic Protestant churches are, say, a Presbyterian church or a Lutheran church, or even some Baptist churches would be much more firm in their ecclesiology than the type of church that seems to have propped up between, say, 1975 and 2000 in so many places, especially in the Sun Belt.
So when you say loose ecclesiology, are you basically saying that these are non-denominational churches mostly, or are there parts of denominations where there's no denominational oversight of the church?
Many of these churches, the two ones I referenced in that article, Sarah McCammon grew up in a sort of charismatic-y, non-denom evangelical church, and John Ward grew up in the Sovereign Grace church, which is a sort of, I think, sort of Calvinist charismatic conglomeration. Kind of had this head figure for a while.
It was its own denomination.
Yeah, I think it was its own denomination. I'm apparently they had sort of a hybridized structure, but one of the words I use in the article is time tested. These things, even in the search for ecclesiology, so many of these people just kind of throw something together. They don't have any sort of institutional seasoning, like, say, a Presbyterian, a Lutheran, some sort of Anglican, or even a Southern Baptist might have.
A lot of Baptist churches are basically congregationalist. So what that basically would mean is the members of the church, their votes determine what the church do, fire the pastor. But I noticed that a number of these non-denominational churches really don't have membership in the sense that like a Baptist church or congregational church would have membership, and that you really can't vote on anything. You might have a membership covenant or something like that, but ultimately there's essentially a self-perpetuating board or a pastor who essentially is structured with absolute power over the church. And this is one of the criticisms of Mars Hill Church and Mark Driscoll, was that essentially there was no accountability for the people at the top. Is that true of these churches, or was there at least some kind of voting structure in place?
Very similar. Very similar. These are almost corporations, whereas a pastor is a sort of CEO. Mm-hmm. that runs the churches, but they're not. There's very little external accountability, so that it's almost highly autonomous corporations is what these churches end up sort of acting like. And in as much as some of them may have a church council or a board or something like that, they're really still answering to the CEO or president of the company. And it is a corporate. I think it's not a coincidence that this type of church props up in the Reagan era. I read Bonfire of the Vanities years ago, and you sort of almost feel like this is a Bonfire of the Vanities ecclesiology. Bonfire of the Vanities, for people who don't know, is a well-known novel by Tom Wolfe about the rise of 1980s Wall Street. And so that's sort of what I came away from. This is thrown together. It's typically done by highly driven, highly successful sort of charismatic people. And so it mirrors the rise of companies. Companies make a lot of money fast. These are churches who make a lot of quote unquote converts fast. And so guess what? If things are going well, you're going to keep giving more and more and more power to the guy at the top.
You use the term in your review, clericalism. I usually associate terms like clericalism with the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
What makes you use the phrase clericalism or the word clericalism?
It's a notion that the pastor, for evangelical listeners, the pastor has sort of authority to speak on sort of almost everything, and you have to look for the pastor for authority. I think one way of thinking about this is this is easy to think about politics. Obviously, there's a lot of political people in churches, but your pastor can tell you to be a good person. The pastor can tell you how to live well. Your pastor actually can't tell you who to vote for. He's not competent enough to tell you who to vote for. And yet you have this reflex where you have a lot of, say, Trumpist style pastors who are telling people you have to vote for the Republican Party or you have to vote for Trump. That might be the right decision. I don't know. But it's not a pastor's job to make that decision. It's not a pastor's job to make that judgment. They actually aren't competent enough to make that judgment. But this sort of evangelical church has ceded to the pastor an almost ex cathedra ability to speak on morality and politics and religion and things like how to order the family. Now, there might be biblical principles that speak to each of those things, but the pastor's not a trained family counselor. He's not a trained political scientist. He's not even usually a trained philosopher. So by ceding this idea that the pastor has competency on these things, you're also ceding the idea he has authority in these things. You're giving sort of clerical authority, this wide range of things that it can exercise in. And that's something that actually the reformers were very careful to mitigate. They didn't want ministers making those sorts of decisions. They were actually very careful about that. And so in our own day, we've sort of dialed back the clock. Evangelicals who would loathe to be identified with Roman Catholics, they're actually emulating Catholics from the medieval era, the Pope's ability to sort of move around princes and kings and speak to sort of anything. That's what modern evangelicals have recreated. And that's something that the reformers were very careful to make sure it was not replicated in their own time.
One of the things that you use as an example of the kinds of statements that these people make is their advice on your sex life in your marriage. Talk about that.
Yeah, so the particular thing was Sarah McCammon. There was a book that was written by Tim and Beverly LaHaye, and I think that's the Left Behind guy. And so what these books would be pastors coaching. It's almost kind of creepy to talk about. It's coaching people on how to do the sex act. And no matter what I say in there is that, like, I think Sarah McCammon can be forgiven for sort of wincing at that a bit, because I'm not sure like what gives a pastor competency to teach on that, right? Like there's no biblical, like the Bible's not an advice book on that. And so I'm not sure where the idea that a pastor would be someone to go talk to about that came from, other than, well, the pastor speaks about the Bible and the Bible speaks about sex. So therefore he must be the guy who we have to talk to about this.
Mm-hmm. One of the people you mentioned is Joshua Harris. who, when he was 21 years old, wrote the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, which was a critical text in the purity culture movement. He later became a pastor in the Sovereign Grace movement. He then became a council member of the Gospel Coalition, and then at some point he started questioning his purity advice, ended up deconstructing his own faith, abandoning Christianity, and is now essentially an ex-evangelical himself. And I wonder to what extent the purity culture movement, which many people have said was harmful to them, and definitely I read I Kissed Dating Goodbye before he yanked the book off the shelves, and it's full of statements about how you're supposed to do dating in life that nobody should be giving you that kind of directive advice. It's given as if it's biblical, and I thought it was basically bad advice for the most part.
Yeah.
And I can see why people who followed it, and it didn't work out, ended up feeling that way. So, and he also got divorced as well, I think, in there. To what extent is the exvangelical movement linked to the purity culture debacle?
I think a lot of it. So I think they are linked. I think the third link. I think that. So, I think a lot of evangelicals, most of their energy is aimed at something like the purity culture. So they sort of put all of their sort of anger against it. Like that's what they direct most of their wrath against. I don't think that's necessarily wrong. What I would say is like purity culture by itself might have been one thing, right? But purity culture done through this uniquely clericalist sort of any given pastor saying, sort of doing thus saith the Lord stuff on how to pursue purity was what made it particularly toxic. So for example, Josh Harris was 21, right? And so in a lot of these churches, you will have these sort of people be sort of semi-ordained by their mid-20s. And that's possible even in relatively normal churches. But I mean, think about this. You're in your 40s, I guess. And I don't know if you have children or not, but if you do have children, imagine going to church and a 22-year-old assistant pastor who's maybe not even married yet, maybe he's about to get married, starts giving advice from the pulpit about marriage and family, or even how to raise kids. That's crazy talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, who the heck would sit there and be like, oh yeah, I'm a 45-year-old man with a wife and a couple kids, and I need to be taking advice from a kid who can't rent a car.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, like that tells me that maybe the issue wasn't even with the idea of purity. That's been around a long time, right? Historically, the word chastity has been used more often than purity. And so let's say, okay, there's always pushes for teenage chastity and rightly ordered, sex lives, whatever it is. But that weird clericalism, that hasn't always been there. And so I think that's what made it particularly bad, is that people were sort of given gurus and told to follow gurus. And the guru's advice was not only shouldn't they have not been giving it, but you're right, a lot of it was bad. And so I think that in so many ways, that's what people are actually reacting against. But they think that that type of clericalism is just how church has worked throughout the ages. And that's not true. They don't have anything older to fall back on. I grew up in the Presbyterian tradition. My great-grandfather was an elder. My grandfather was an elder. My dad was an elder. I saw kind of the rise and fall of evangelicalism. And if I would have thought that was the church, I might have deconstructed too. But I had something else to fall back on, which was this older tradition, this older kind of way of thinking about not only morality, not just church per se, but authority, right? My pastors were pretty careful. They would preach, and there wasn't sort of this idea that I can speak on anything. And I think that's the first cause of so much of the exvangelical movement, is that clericalism.
My impression is that most of the people who talk about being hurt by purity culture were women. Is there any sort of gender skew in the exvangelical movement overall?
That I've not read enough of those books to speak authoritatively on the numbers, but I will say I have read men who say, John Ward, felt like it wasn't particularly helpful for him. And I think this sort of the purity culture created almost a fear of human sexuality. And so that's not to, I don't want to say that purity is bad, or chastity. I like the word chastity better than purity.
Well, that was their term, the purity.
Yeah. Purity was definitely their term. So chastity is not bad. But I mean, the way it became almost this kind of primary lens through which virtue and holiness was litigated through, that, I mean, it does seem like it got oppressive for a lot of people. So I may not agree where those folks landed, but it's hard to actually fault people for saying this seems kind of weird.
So based on what you told me about the kinds of churches where people turn into ex-evangelicals, is it fair to say your ordinary vanilla Southern Baptist church or United Methodist church did not have very much deconstructive ex-evangelical output?
I think when people leave those churches, they do so quietly. I think one of the things you realize is there's a moral energy in these evangelical churches that sort of gets people to almost a sort of heightened state of, of what I might call it psychosocial devotion. And so when they leave that, guess what? They have a heightened psychosocial state when they leave too. If you're just a certain person who's just kind of religious and you went to a United Methodist church or a Southern Baptist church or some sort of mainline church, you kind of, it's a fizzle out. With the ex-evangelicals, it's an explosion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that plenty of people probably leave other churches, but it doesn't have the sort of psychosocial energy that evangelicalism creates, at least.
It strikes me that while some of these churches may have been little mini papal fiefdoms or papal states, if you will, things like purity culture got very big and very mainstream. These folks obviously were able to make alliances and receive support and validation from mainstream figures within evangelicalism. So I mentioned that, Joshua Harris was a Gospel Coalition council member. So at some point, those guys put their kind of seal of approval on him. What role did sort of, if any, did sort of validation of these people by senior figures or elder statesman type people make it possible for them to succeed and do what they did?
Yeah, I think I'm reading David Platt's Radical now, which is a book that was in currency too. And I don't think David Platt's a monster or anything like that, but the book's kind of nutty. And I was thinking about, like, this is a book. It has all of these prominent people who blurbed it: Russell Moore and Ed Stetzer, kind of these evangelical, bigwigs. And it hit me that so much of how evangelicalism works is based on a sort of Führerprinzip, the leader principle. And so there are evangelical leaders. And the problem is that when you have people who are leaders, you really are still doing personality-driven church. Like, you're really not going to church, you're going to a personality. And so guess what? When a personality says, oh, that other personality is valid, you get kind of this soup, right? Of just kind of, we all may have some disagreements, but, we're all kind of doing the same thing. So if we all can kind of at least, agree to disagree on the stuff that we don't like or do like, you get basically, I don't want to call it anarchy, but you get the worst of anarchy and the worst of authoritarianism all in the same mix. And so you have a complete anarchy where the people actually aren't governing ideas or governing what they say, and at least the way Protestants have governed what comes from the pulpit. But you also have people saying things without any sort of corrective. So it's anarchy and authoritarianism all at once. And I think it may be one of the reasons why there's sort of a fracture going on in those groups, now. Like you've heard the fracturing of evangelicalism mentioned quite a bit in the discourse. And I think it's because it was always the worst of authoritarianism and the worst of anarchy, kind of in one mix. There's very little serious churchmanship. I'll mention this. David Platt regularly he doesn't refer to his church community, he says his faith family. And so think about what that is. What do families have? Families have father figures, families have paternal figures. And what else is a pastor other than the kind of a chief pastor? And so I don't think this makes them sort of, meaningfully patriarchalist or whatever, but it does mean their idea of authority at the church is vested in this one guy, this one leader. And historically, ecclesiastical authority is more diffuse. Even Anglicans diffuse their authority. The bishop is not a prince. Presbyterians have plurality of elders. Lutherans have elders and pastors and synodical and district presidents who are sort of de facto bishops. So there's a diffusion of power in historic Protestantism that is completely not the case in at least these evangelical circles. And so when you get sort of, let's say, the Gospel Coalition had a lot of PCA people and a lot of SBCers kind of interacting, when they've basically agreed to not prioritize how they govern themselves in pursuit of the gospel, what you're prioritizing, what you're not prioritizing is governing the pastors. And so I think that's where you get this strange mix of clericalism and anarchy.
With these churches that are sort of exvangelical factories, do many of them have what you might call bespoke theologies or peculiarities, theological or teaching peculiarities of the pastor?
Well, I think it's all the pastor. I think that, your theology is your pastor's theology, especially, a church without any sort of written confession is basically theology is done really at the whim of the leadership. I think this is why you see so many of them kind of lurch from, well, now, we're taking our church in the direction of Calvinism, or we're taking our church in the direction of the charismatic movement. Variously, it's pastors shouldn't be able to do that. Like, that's not how Protestant churches work. Like, a pastor doesn't actually get to decide what your theology is. Pastor's supposed to teach theology, not decide it. And so it's, for a guy like me who grew up Presbyterian, like, that would just be kind of just insane that a pastor could do that. Usually he has elders who kind of hem him in, but the culture even of elders is different. I know some of these evangelical churches have elders. Well, how do they have elders? Well, because the pastor makes the church big, and then he gets guys who like him. They say, well, you know what? You're going to be an authority now. You're going to be a pastor, or you're going to be an elder. And so it's still kind of run through the personality of this chief sort of pastor head person.
Well, people are loving this discussion because we have over 500 people watching live, which is great.
Is that normal for you? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting. When I started streaming, I used to stream to YouTube only, and I get maybe a handful of live viewers on YouTube. X is a great platform for live streaming, but this is more maybe than typical, and it's been growing the whole time. So that's good. You sort of do make a distinction between these sort of clericalist churches that had these problems in the mainstream, but what you're describing sounds a lot to me like your standard evangelical megachurch, where it's very driven by a charismatic, in the ordinary sense of the word, pastor. People go because they love his preaching, they love his style, weak ecclesiastical structures. Is there really a distinction between these? To what extent is this? I guess where I'm going is, I think it's very tempting, and you even make the distinction between sort of Pentecostals and evangelicals. When I look at the fragmenting of evangelicalism, here's what I see. I see a bunch of people who want to essentially put some daylight between themselves and elements that they view as problematic. The issue is not evangelicalism or whatever we're calling ourselves now. Some of them don't, when you get rid of the label. The problem's the Pentecostals over here, or the problem was these people over here. but is the problem really contained in a subset, or is the problem more general? And this idea of trying to draw distinctions, a way of sort of distancing ourselves from sort of culpability in a model?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mentioned in there that I think that what we call evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, I think a certain type of evangelicalism would like that line to be blacker and firmer and there to be more space. I'm just not convinced. I think, at least in the last 50 years, there's sort of a growing syncretism that you see. And I don't want to pick on the Gospel Coalition, because there's a lot of fine people there. But like, you look at a group like the Gospel Coalition, and you would ask, okay, what do they share? And like Calvinistic-ishness, and is like maybe a little bit of evangel. So I'm not sure what these groups actually share, but I'm also not sure what they're different on.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have basically had a flattening of theology and ecclesiology, whereby the idea of what binds these groups is, quote unquote, proclaiming the gospel. And they just don't ask a lot of questions after that. Okay, well, what is the gospel? And, well, like, what is the gospel? Who is Jesus? Like, you just don't ask a lot of questions, because I think that this late sort of 20th century model of evangelicalism, which probably exists still in groups a little bit like the Gospel Coalition, is a sort of consumer-driven religion. Right? That's a reason why megachurches exist, right? You've got coffee shops, you've got, all of this stuff in so many of them, not all of them, but in a lot of them. And so I think, in as much as people want to separate, say, well, let's put the charismatics over there. I think the charismatics may have a stronger expression of some of this. I don't think that actually that's separate from a lot of, like, I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. There's a big church called Elevation Church.
Yeah, Stephen Furtick.
Yeah, Stephen Furtick. And so, like, I grew up Presbyterian, so my observation of Stephen Furtick is, I guess he's a Southern Baptist, but I would view him as Pentecostal. And
Mm-hmm.
that's because my eyes are kind of in older, kind of institutional waspy Protestantism. And so anything like that looks kind of like Pentecostally, evangelically. I don't know what's different. Like, what would make him different from a Pentecostal? Well, maybe specific views on the nature of the gifts, but the church experience is not any different, probably, for many people who come from some sort of charismatic background.
You make a point at the end that's a point that you recur to over and over, and you've alluded to your past in the Presbyterian Church. I believe you're Anglican today.
Yeah.
And this idea that evangelicalism is not Protestantism. And, it's interesting. When I went to work for a conservative think tank, one of the things that I realized was I literally had no idea where American conservatism came from. And they talk about the permanent things, the big ideas and the American founding, but I'm like, I didn't really know its origin story or its history. So I started reading. I read George Nash's history. Mm-hmm. I started reading history. I want to read Matthew Continetti's book on the right. So I started reading, and you start get a different picture of what conservatism looks like when you know the history and the personalities. And I feel like it's that for these churches. You go to these churches, and in evangelicalism, church history simply does not exist. Maybe it goes back to Billy Graham. That's it. And where did this stuff come from? I still don't know that I have a strong knowledge of that. It's not an area that I've chosen to do a lot of study on, but I do read a lot of people who are not church historians, but who talk about these things. So I finally read Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And what Max Weber is saying about Protestantism is not reflective at all of American evangelicalism. What he describes as, the Calvinist ethic is not the ethic of any Calvinist alive today. Right. When I read, that French writer Emmanuel Todd's talk about Protestantism and its beliefs and where it came from and why it was so formative to the West, or read E. Digby Baltz's sociology of the WASP upper class, these these people give a view of Protestantism, historic Protestantism, that is radically different than evangelicals. And even if you walk into a mainline church, and, you know, I've sort of made a practice of visiting mainline churches and sampling them online. The culture is completely different.
Right.
From even a PCA. So I could say I'm a Presbyterian. You go to a PCA church in the north, it is completely different from a mainline Presbyterian church culturally. You know, you might say that they adhere to the same theology, and that maybe the PCA believes it in a way that maybe the mainlines don't. But I'm like, the culture is totally and completely different. And so you see this, and I think it's like a lot of people. I realize I'm doing the talking here. They encounter these things, and it creates a sense of alienation, which leads them to Catholicism or Orthodoxy or something else, or it leads them to Anglicanism, where, you know, people, and you always saw this thing going back to the 80s, the people who converted to Catholicism often had a story involving studying church history, which is, you come with nothing, and now you're seeing this stuff, and it creates a sense of alienation. And so I guess I'm curious about your perspective on this issue, because when you start having these sorts of experiences, I think it does have a tendency towards alienating you from evangelicalism and discounting it as an authentic expression of Christianity and Protestantism.
Yeah, I think that some of what I think the term evangelicalism is so fraught these days. Is that political expression? Is it religious? So I think to be an evangelical is historically just to be a Protestant who's really serious about the Bible. And so in that sense, I'm still an evangelical. I think evangelicalism is, you mentioned mid-century. I think evangelicalism is really a creation of a specific sort of, and I'm not using consumeristic in a pejorative sense here, because I think we're all consumerists in some ways.
We're Americans. It's our identity. That's our culture.
Right, yeah. So I don't like the idea that the reflex is that people whose religious expression is more consumer driven are somehow bad, or, you know, particularly egregious. But so much of the energy of what we call evangelicalism intellectually has come out of places like Wheaton, which are very much products of the rise of figures like Billy Graham at mid-century. And so I think, as George Marsden said, an evangelical is someone who likes Billy Graham. A fundamentalist is someone who doesn't. And my question was always, well, what about like a conservative Protestant who doesn't think about Billy Graham a whole lot, which is what, you know, I grew up in North Carolina. I thought about Billy Graham because I had to drive on the road that had his name that went to the airport. I didn't like Billy Graham, didn't really figure a lot in my churchmanship or in the way I viewed religion. And so I think in that sense, I don't think I had a sort of a start to religion in 1955 or 1960 in suburban Chicago. And some of that's experience. You know, I grew up with my great grandparents. My great grandmother was born in 1898. So I knew people who had experienced Protestant religion well before the development of the sociocultural idea of evangelicalism. And I had access to that history in a way that maybe a lot of suburbanites don't. And that's not a condemnation of anyone who doesn't have access to it. I just think that so much of what we call evangelical is actually sociology, and we think it's theology.
Right. No, I would agree with that. I mean, evangelicalism is a subculture and should be defined sociologically rather than theological. Right. That's the point I made in my book, is I take a sociological view of what evangelicalism is. I want to get to the last topic here. You have a very interesting and provocative line in the article. Again, there's a link to this Mere Orthodoxy article in the show notes. You say, there was, in fact, a strange mix of evangelical clericalism and charismatic political action that Trump effectively harnessed in unique ways. What do you mean by that?
Oh, he figured it out. I think that he figured it out, and he's, I mean, I don't think Trump's a particularly religious guy. I think he's a political guy. And so in that sense, he's a bit smarter than his recent predecessors. I mean, Trump figured out, I'm doing politics. These people will be people I can use, and I can give them stuff that will keep. I mean, he figured out transactional politics with conservative Christians in a way no one else had. And I think some of that is just kind of something that's been around for a long time. All Christians have done transactional politics, but there's a certain socio-moral rhetoric that evangelicals had told themselves that they weren't doing transactional politics. So you think about the proposition of, it's like the ERLs. What's that thing called? The Southern Baptist?
The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.
Yeah. So that thing, I forget which letters it is. But so the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission under Bush was doing transactional politics, just like the Seven Mountains or Dementia or whatever the heck they are, revivalists are doing with Trump. I think what you've finally seen is just political realignment and sociological realignment has finally caught up with with a sociological group, evangelicals, who thought they were a theological group.
When I read that line, it made me think of what John Seal said in a podcast I did with him and in an article he wrote, where he talks about this sociological concept of habitus, which is essentially the deep culture and myths and practices of a particular group, maybe their way of life. You can think about it. And he made what I think was a provocative and very accurate diagnosis, where he says, look, Donald Trump is exactly like one of these figures you just talked about. He is the charismatic leader. He is the pope of his movement. It's the one guy thing. He's putting on a show. He resonates with evangelical because he resembles their leaders and the culture of evangelicalism itself, even if he came out of, mainline Protestantism.
That strikes me as completely right. I think for so many evangelicals, they really convinced themselves they were apolitical. Mm-hmm. Well, we're working with George Bush to get, kids in Africa fed, or whatever the heck it was at the time. And so many evangelicals told themselves, we're not doing politics. Why? Because we're doing it with George Bush, who's a compassionate conservative, and we're doing it in the service of, whatever NGO group, it might be. In the 19-teens, the Southern Baptist Convention was wildly involved with the U.S.'s involved with the U.S. going into World War I. And in fact, Criswell, one of these famous Baptist guys, said, look, the victory of democracy, a la Wilson, is the victory of Baptist. And so there's a reason why Woodrow Wilson had him sort of be almost a chief figure forming a chaplaincy corps. So I think the fact of the matter is this has been going on a long time. I mean, a certain type of Protestant has been deeply invested in Americanism, political Americanism, which is, I think, what Trump is an expression of.
Yeah, at my church in New York, which was a really old Presbyterian church, mainline church on the Upper East Side, there's a plaque in the narthex that is a list of the honor roll of people from that congregation who served in World War I. There's nothing from World War II or any of that, but World War I is right there with like stars next to the people who died. That's a very interesting point about World War I.
Yeah, and so I think Trump is an expression of that. What's interesting to me, you'll see this quite a bit. There's this, and actually there's been a lot of leftist scholars push back against it, so good for them. I think if you want to follow one really great scholar on the left, Sam Hasselby is fantastic. But the idea that Trump's sort of downstream from like Southern religion, and Southern folk religion and like the era of slavery, it's nonsense. I mean, he's a creation of the sort of liberal democratic Americanism that was really, had its sort of strongest champions in places like New York City and places like Boston. And so basically, there's a lot of that movement has left it to go secular. And so now there's just evangelicals, charismatics, whatever you want to call them, filling the void in the old Americanist kind of institutional world, Christian Americanism, which I think is a better term than Christian nationalism, by the way, for what Trump does.
Last question. Based on your reading and all of your analysis, what would you tell evangelical leaders? And let's think about a megachurch pastor, a prototypical megachurch pastor. what advice would you give them, or ideas would you give them to consider on how to move in what you would consider a healthier, better direction?
I think some of it would be to think about the relationship between proclamation and authority. Like what you say is, because most of the people in their churches are trained to sort of think of pastors as a specific type of authority. So whatever you say, you sure as heck got to be careful about it, because someone's going to take it seriously. And so I think just maybe realizing that I could say this. I would just say, I'm not saying expository preaching is the best. I mean, I go to a church that uses a lectionary, but just to temper the tendency to view yourself as a leader of a church. I think this is where so much of it becomes a problem. People think they are leading, when actually historically, what do pastors do? They celebrate communion and preach the word. That's what their historical duties are. And so I think the way to sort of mitigate some of this is just be careful about getting outside of your job, basically. Like, I mean, sometimes I think we need to be kind of, I know a lot of pastors in the COVID era were like, oh, everybody's so mean to me. Okay, fine. I think some ways Americans could actually use a healthy bit of anti-clericalism. And by the way, I think that if there's anything to be said for some aspects of the Christian nationalist movement, especially some of the works that have been written, they are proposing that maybe pastors shouldn't talk about politics so much. I think what they're asking is maybe politics people should talk about how Christianity works with politics instead of pastors. And so it's sort of a investor controversy, the 11th century war between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor all over again amongst evangelicals. So my advice would be just maybe don't talk about things you're not particularly trained in.
Well, Miles, we're now up to 700 viewers. This is great. For all of you watching out there on X, please do give me a follow there. If you're on YouTube, again, subscribe to my channel, hit the like button, leave a rating on Apple Podcasts, tell your friends to sign up. And again, my guest today has been Miles Smith, who's an assistant professor of history at Hillsdale College. We're here to discuss his article, Reading the Exvangelicals, which is available over at Mere Orthodoxy, and there's a link to that in the show notes. Miles, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Aaron.